Hello and welcome to the Flourishing Introvert Talks with me, Jo Rawbone. This is the podcast that celebrates the natural gifts of introverts so that we can flourish in all situations. Episode 260. Rattling cages, fueling change and flourishing. I want to start by saying wow, just wow, and actually thank you. This episode concludes 22 seasons of the Flourishing Introvert Talks, and that's immense. And 22 is a very important number to me. I started this podcast back in 2020 with a view to busting the myths and misconceptions that do we introverts a huge disservice. We only have to look around to recognise the role that introverted leaders have played in global and business success to know that those myths are a nonsense. And as for the fact that we have nothing to say for ourselves, well, I think 22 seasons worth proves that myth wrong. My biggest thanks, though, go to you, the listeners, who made over 65,000 downloads a reality on just one platform alone, and at last glance from across 58 countries. That's no mean feat for such a niche podcast, and whether you found this podcast for the very first time today, have been with me since the beginning, or are an occasional listener, you're welcome. And since my skilled and efficient team picked up the reins on producing this podcast, many more of you are also listening on additional platforms, and it's now available on every social destination possible. And that fills my heart. Because the more places it's available, the more introverts get to understand that they are more than enough, and the more those who live with us and love us understand us better. I so appreciate you joining me on this journey. I also want to thank the flourishing personalities, my guests who also showed that they have things to say that are worth hearing. And that's important to me, as introverts have value to add and contributions to make to the equitable and inclusive changes we need to see in society and business. But sometimes it's difficult to get our voices into the conversation. What I realised, though, is that if I created my own podcast, I could always get my message out there to be heard by those who want to know more. That doesn't mean it's always been easy, though. Just like any worthwhile project or mission, come to think of it. I've chosen to use my fear as necessary fuel to propel me forwards, though, and it's really a choice, and more on that later. What makes the choice so much easier, even if I do feel a little bit sick and my legs are trembling, is knowing that my mission matters. It started when I got so mad at seeing we quieter ones overlooked and undervalued that I spoke up. And I continue to speak up and into forums that would rather I was quiet. I rattle the cages that restrain we introverts and make it so much harder to reach our potential. Being the positive bunny that I am, I always hope that the cages I mention are both unintentionally and unconsciously built. That is a case of my positivity streak, though, because I know that's not always the case. People have said to me when I've shared my mission, good luck with that, and not in an encouraging way, but in a defeatist way, that actually suggests that I'd be better off sitting down and shutting up. And I know my mission is huge. I'm under no illusion there, but that doesn't negate its value and benefits. Whilst we're already seeing some of the anticipated benefits, the majority will take much longer to realise than I have life left in me, and that's okay. I'm here creating movement, and a movement, come to that. This is about consistent effort to shift the bias and leave a legacy in people, as Peter Stropel reminds us. And of course I do this with positive intention in my calm, gently persuasive and occasionally sassy way. Quietly gutsy is a great description for the way I approach things and the way I approach people that I find challenging. The people I've always admired are the ones who show me who and how they are. I long since learned that what someone says they're about is often not backed up by what they do. For me, congruence, so the words and the deeds need to match. I really can't enable introverts to flourish if I'm not flourishing myself. I can't encourage them to use their voices if I'm not using mine. I can't show them how to be visible if I'm invisible. But I'm human, and because flourishing is a journey, not a destination, sometimes it will be a bit sketchier than others. What matters to me is that I am prepared to be vulnerable, so I share the ups and downs of my journey with you, my listeners, as well as with my clients. We're all human after all, and my intention is to help us all do, be, and feel the best we can. Flourishing is never about compromising who we are, but playing to our strengths as we learn and grow. I acknowledge that I've been on what I now refer to as the flourishing leg of my life's journey just for the past 10 years. Unusually for many women of my age, I have felt my most fulfilled, powerful and alive during these last 10 years. The invisibility of old age is not for me. Prior to that, as a lifelong learner, I'd been intentionally growing and developing since the early 80s, actually. I was a late developer who couldn't wait to leave school and has then studied both formally and informally ever since. Learning lights me up and fills me with joy. In those early days, though, my development choices were more what I felt I ought to do to help me fit in and get on in the business environment. Looking back, I felt a heaviness and a sense of obligation during those years. It's only latterly that the paths I've chosen are more aligned with my introverted temperament. I now understand that the quality of my contribution is way, way more valuable than aiming for quantity and volume. I mentioned earlier that I use my fear as fuel. I choose to turn and face fear in order to be able to use it as such. The thing I've found about fear is that I can either hide from it and use it as an excuse to stay safe but stuck, which is what I used to do, or I can turn to face it in order to make progress. Being quietly gutsy, there's usually only one option for me: turn and face the fear with a smile on my face and courage in my heart. Many of you will have heard about my trusty mantra, which is purpose plus passion trumps fear, and it serves me well to this day. And in case you're wondering, it hasn't always been this way. I had a serious lack of self-confidence and low self-esteem as a young adult, tinged with a serious dose of people-pleasing. So if you'd have told me back then that I'd be speaking on stages to over 1,000 people, calling out the bias when I see it and advocating for our rights and needs as introverts, I doubt I would have believed you. I still carried a degree of shame and even a little resentment that I'd been essentially excluded just for being me. Such was the stigma. But then that stigma transmuted into indignance at the injustice, which helped me to use my voice for the good of we introverts. It's only a couple of years ago that a very senior extroverted leader in one of my long-term clients pushed back in our conversation about the bias, saying, "Let's face it, Joe, extroverts are so much easier to get on with." Then, just a couple of weeks ago, I heard from the HR team in that organisation that in a meeting, this same senior extroverted leader said, "But what about the introverts? We need to make sure they're included." Now, that may sound like a small win, but it's bigger than many of you realise, and it really is progress. So I invite you to ask yourself this simple yet powerful question. What fears have you felt so strongly that they actually provide sufficient energy for you to use that fear as fuel? You see, a meh isn't going to cut it, but a fear born of injustice will. But is it okay that we're still facing this injustice, this insidious bias embedded in so many areas of our lives? I say absolutely not, and none of us can change this on our own, but collaboratively and collectively, as a sassy, courageous guild, we can work wonders. It's also part of the reason I want younger introverts to realise this at a much earlier age than I did. I'm not someone who does regrets, and yet I can't help but wonder how my life might have been if I'd have known that what made me different was my introversion and not some flaw or weakness. That's the main reason I created my book, Quiet is Fun Too. At one level, I see this as the beautifully illustrated book that it is for children to enjoy and eventually read themselves, but it's also a parental guide and a teaching resource. As a young child, I would always take myself to bed earlier than I needed to so that I could lose myself in my fantastical and magical books. That's what introverted children tend to do, and I wanted to provide them with a resource to help them know they are enough. They don't need fixing or to be louder. They need to learn how to love their difference. So as parents, siblings, caregivers, extended family members or teachers, I know we have a responsibility to understand the introverts in our midst better. I believe we have a duty of care to other humans to appreciate our differences and look to where those differences make us stronger and united, not weaker and further divided. Do I sound a bit preachy? Then so be it. As I said earlier, having my own podcast means I get to say what I mean and when I choose. Sadly, my parents died before they got to witness my TEDx talk or hear my podcast, so I'm not sure how much they really understood about my uniqueness. They always encouraged me to stand up for myself, and my father in particular was hot on saying what needed to be said and no more. He hated spin, exaggeration, and deception. He didn't have a good word to say about the people he called Twitterers, and that was long before the little blue bird, as was, existed. My dear father helped me to realise that being different does not mean being wrong or inadequate. When we value differences, whether it be age, gender, ethnicity, personality type, neurodiversity or neurodivergence for that matter, collectively we are greater than the sum of the parts. It's not a lot to ask, although in today's divisive society it may feel it. Baby steps, everyone. Baby steps. All of which means this bias isn't going to disappear anytime soon. But that doesn't mean that staying focused on this change is not worth the effort. It's a matter of belief, and I, for one, believe wholeheartedly in this mission. It's why I'm still here, still talking, still rattling cages, and still advocating for we introverts. Understanding the nature of change in organisations as I do, I realise that it's going to take time for the oil tanker that is this bias to pick up the signal on its satellite radio before it even believes it needs to slow or change course. What stops the message being picked up and taken notice of, though? Well, one of the things that stops it is the current culture as perpetuated from the ship's captain down through the ranks. Even if the radio operator understands the message and believes in it, lone operators have to pick their moment so they're not accused of insubordination or of being a mutineer. You have to be pretty ballsy to be prepared to walk the gangplank in front of your peers. Then there's the predictable and natural resistance to change. Part of the problem is that those who created the biased processes are loath to give them up or see them changed, and they often take a suggestion to change as a personal criticism. There's a real paradox here, as we're hardwired for growth and almost equally suspicious of change that's not of our own making. Overcoming this is not for the faint-hearted, and fortunately I have loads of tools in my tool bag to assist me with this, so I'm better equipped than most to be a positive disruptor and take the ranks with me. I'm done with playing small and safe, as that's not how progress is made. That way complacency and stagnation lie. In order to interrupt the norms so the bias tilts and then shifts, I need to keep speaking out. For me, that's why I continue to have uncomfortable conversations with business leaders in ways that rattle their cages. That's the best way for me to flourish as an introvert right now, even though I know there will be peaks and valleys on the road ahead. I say, bring them on. It helps that I do what I can to anticipate the challenges and the pushbacks, so I know how best to respond. Once a project manager, always a project manager. I know I will come up against real resistance that often originates from fear, so I need to be able to stay focused as I persuasively change the mindsets of the stuck. I need to keep using my mantra of purpose plus passion trumps fear, because I know there will be times when I feel afraid. When the big beasts in an organisation rear up aggressively, baring their teeth menacingly, I need to stand my ground to show that in spite of being fearful, I'm still prepared to speak out about my mission. My intention is to continue to remain focused and committed in my quietly gutsy way. Resilience will be my trusty weapon, and boundaries my strongest armour as I continue on with the fight. Hark at me and my fighting talk, the biggest, softest pacifist I know. But I am creating a legacy to leave in others, from the youngest generations to the oldest, and they in turn will tilt the bias still further. I do have my moments where I wonder if anyone is listening, and then I receive unsolicited feedback, and I've had occasions where strangers approach me at a conference to tell me what a difference I've made to them. Those ready to flourish and help others to do so are listening and taking action. So with the help of my team, I'll keep being visible as I share my clear message unwaveringly. Here's my commitment to you. I promise you my patience, persistence and resilience. For now, though, I'll leave you with my heartfelt thanks for tuning into this episode and any others, and for sharing your reviews and feedback as it resources me to keep going. These 22 seasons have been revealing for me, and I'm learning and sharing all of the time. So here's to the next 22 and the continued tilting of the bias as it levels towards we introverts. If you enjoyed this episode as much as I did, then please subscribe, rate us and leave a comment, because we know that helps other people find the podcast. And if other people find us, other introverts can flourish.
You are listening to an Intentional Media Production podcast.